now have the space for Todd Falkowsky. Todd, it's really wonderful to have you here with us. Todd is an experienced brand consultant and creative director. He's working globally with some of the world's leading agencies and brands for the past 25 years. He recently launched his own brand consultancy called Citizen Brand to help small brands and startups create maximum value and growth. Todd has produced influential exhibits and research projects, including Objecting, Survey of Tobias Wong, and has collaborated with the MoMA, the Cooper Hewitt, and the Royal Ontario Museum. Additionally, he is an active educator, speaker, writer, and is the publisher of the Canadian Design Resource, Canada's largest open source collection of design. The first of its kind, it's an archive of Canadian design chosen by the public and is also a public citizen space to choose, define, and curate. I'm really, really pleased to have you here, Todd, to show us the design resource and what it's about, also NOR, and this incredible overview of design that you actually started for us all. Thank you so much for being here, Todd.
Thank you. Do I just jump into my presentation? Is that kind of the process?
Yep, just go for it, Todd.
And get started. So I want to say thank you for Cynthia for getting me involved in this. Exciting to meet some of these people. You know, it seems so Canadian that it took a Dutch project to kind of bring us together. You know, seeing these projects, half of which I knew and others I had no idea about. It seems so Canadian. I'm not sure if that's the scale of this place or what, but it's well, I'm just thankful to be here. Well, in a nutshell, I was born in a farm in Saskatchewan. Bill, I didn't realize you were from there. Great to see a fellow traveler. I think like most people in that small place, I couldn't wait to get out of there. The really only escape route was if you played hockey, which I didn't. Eventually, thankfully, my paths crossed with Cynthia's in Vancouver at a design school there, or college at the time. And thanks to Cynthia, brought me to the Netherlands, and we continued our studies there. I was grateful to become somewhat global in my design practice. I've really spent my time across the industry. I was a designer, an architect, a professor, a curator, a publisher. I think that's fairly common in the creative industries, that people end up wearing a few caps as they move along. While most of my career has been outside of Canada, during that time abroad, I spent time in Italy, the Netherlands, of course, and New York and others. I always looked back at Canada and wondered kind of what was holding it back, and what lessons I was learning in these places on how functioning the design industries were compared to my homeland. And an opportunity brought me back, which was the largest design school was trying to really renew its design program. Ironically, now 15 years later, they were trying to get away from making and into the thinking side, the consulting side of the designer. They got rid of all their making stuff. They got rid of the kilns, got rid of the weaving departments, it's really shocking now to imagine that's what they thought the growth was. But they were looking for people to come in and help kind of revamp the program and make it kind of produce more consultants than makers. And it was at that time that I also got connected to the federal government, who was beginning to explore what Made in Canada meant, what Brand Canada meant. That was with the Economic Ministry, Joe Flaherty. And it was, you know, I was a bit stunned to be in the room that, you know, here was a person really who had spent the last 10 years collecting stories and images of Canadian design, somehow was seen as an expert. It somehow seemed to me to be kind of like evidence of the poor diet that was happening here, that the creative industries didn't seem to have writers and archivists and curators and journalists. that somehow I ended up being seen as a person that should be working with the federal government, helping them understand what their brand was. But regardless, I was grateful also to make that journey through with them. So the archive started very small. It really was from that economic development thing that I started to collect these really quite aggressively. At that time, Google was emerging, and you really typed in Canadian design, nothing came up. You wouldn't find anything. So it was, you couldn't even search it in a contemporary way. And so I began to collect these stories and pictures and interviews and other odds and ends. And it was really during that time that I came across this kind of wake up, which was to begin to understand a place, you really need to explore what they make. And this became the premise for the archive. So, this wasn't a new idea. It was a little bit fresh in Canada, but of course, elsewhere, we really could understand places by what they were making. And you can line up, especially European places, really anywhere that's kind of modern. You could really grab stuff and say, hey, look at these 3 items. You could say Italy. And then behind there, the concepts of speed, velocity. I did a project with Ferrari trying to make them more sustainable in their Formula One program. And I was blown away by how much craft, like they were literally taking people from the shoe industries and fashion industry to make the interiors of like multi-million-dollar Ferraris. And I just thought that combination of high tech and low tech and craft was so compelling. Of course, we see the industries and wakes behind fashion brands there, food brands. The point I'm making is, if you look at what countries are making, you really can understand who lives there and kind of how they exert their brands into the global conversation. Now, Canada has gotten itself into a bit of a strange place. Our brand is not built on its makers. And you can really see that when people kind of come to visit us, they come to Toronto and go to like Ripley's Aquarium. They'll go to, they'll go to a museum called the ROM that's full of English armor. There isn't a Canadian museum. Like, don't go. There's nowhere to go when you come to Toronto and experience Canada. You really don't step into anything. There's no food. You kind of come here and have sushi and go to the aquarium and maybe stand beside what once was the tallest building in the world. But you'll leave home with nothing but souvenirs of maybe some golf balls with maple leafs on them. And I think if you think of Canada, everyone thinks of beavers, hockey sticks, maple syrup, antlers, and that Canadians themselves also live in this like weird bubble. That's not just visitors who kind of think of us as the big, this huge outdoors, but we have kind of convinced we're that as well. And this narrow view of the country has flattened our global contribution and the level of sophistication that we see ourselves. And where this really vets out is, it's a surprise to somebody if someone like won a Nobel Peace Prize from Canada, or you really produced anything that didn't have an antler on it and it doesn't appear Canadian. So it's really hard to innovate here, and it's hard to kind of go out into the global stage without having these trappings attached, or no one sees it as Canadian. And of course, our biggest brands, the ones that, when you look at other places, like say in America, you look at Apple and Nike, their influence isn't stuck to nostalgia or the past. It's creating new ideas and new thinking that they can project back on the culture, and the culture in turn kind of grows and evolves from that. So we look at our biggest brands, they're also wrapped in this fantasy. They're also stuck in these kind of illusions. So like, here's 2 of the biggest ones that they didn't do anything new. They looked to the past and used this myth to create their own brand story. Because the world thinks we're a great big outdoor. Of course, the biggest brands we have are going to tell that story as well. It just shortcuts their marketing. But the impact really is that it flattens our culture. Now, the broken narrative has really blocked the story of Canada. We're strangled by this nostalgic story, and very few brands fit it. I was blown away kind of doing a little bit of homework for this presentation or chat today. And this idea of, here's 2 postcards, one's from the early 1920s, and here's one I literally got last week. It's the same place, same thing, same story, that we just can't break out of this mold. Now, there's really 3 main kind of drivers to Canadian identity. One, of course, is this, which is nature. There's no denying that these are legit. We live with them. We're familiar with them. But it's my kind of premise that until we can kind of get free of them or broaden them, that we're going to be continually caught in them. And again, now we respect that nature is obviously a major driver of living in Canada, and it drives our art and our making industries for sure. The next one, of course, is this colonial feel, which is also real. Here's the latest loonie that was put out when the Queen died. Here's one of our early postage stamps with the Queen on it. We have lived with these images in our daily life. We see them every day. There are money, there are postage, there are entertainment. And I think we've inherited quite a bit of the views of, the colonial British identity, a narrow set of perspectives, very conservative, anti-First Nation, pro-business, anti-environment. And it's actually created, living under a colonial leader, it's made Canadians quite risk averse. That risk is seen as danger. So instead of attaching ourselves to people like who went across the West, or the First Nations who taught us how to learn from the land, or pioneers who went across the country bravely, we have these images of the monarchy, and we still kind of have to deal with that. Now, without a doubt, Americans know us best. We live next to them, we assimilate with them, and their brands really sneak into our consciousness. American culture washes across Canadian life, and strangely, Canadians probably know more about what's going on in America than they do in their own country. We definitely follow American politics. We eat American food, we wear American clothing, we watch American television, all the things that you might normally think would be homegrown. We are not doing that. Again, we read American books and magazines, music, it's all our top lists here. And the kind of thing that's interesting is when you look at these two American brands coming into Canada, all they had to do to come into Canada was put a maple leaf on their logo. They didn't have to go through some mass transformation to come here. They just had to knock the leaf on, and Canadians were satisfied with that. That was enough. So it shows how these trappings that we live with are really, we're really strapped by them. We didn't demand much for the colonizers to come in. They just merely had to put a flag on it. And we also see brands that were Canadian that were successful and then became bought by Americans, as long as they continued to be cloaked in Canadianisms, we would consume them and really call them our own. I mean, I think most people don't realize that these two products all the profits go back to America. This is our most popular fast food chain, Tim Hortons on the left, and one of the most popular beers is Canadian. So again, just by wrapping itself in this Canadianism is enough for the Canadian population to buy it. Now, Canadians are very comfortable in nostalgia. New is hard. But this, of course, means that we end up looking backwards more than looking forwards. Yeah, so this has created quite a tumbling national image of ourselves. And I thought kind of a way to show the condition of the Canadian national image was to show our national costume at Miss Universe, which was this bit of a train wreck of hockey sticks, maybe some lumberjack in there. I'm not sure, maybe a royal, I don't know, Marie Antoinette kind of thing. I don't even know what this is, right? And of course, it was laughed at and became quite a story here of, what the hell? What was this? and the designer who made it has kind of become a little bit notorious. But this is kind of, to me, a symptom. Again, during the Miss Universe, of course, Germany came out with Hugo Boss. Prada came out, dressing their Italians. It just, to me, was a symptom of kind of how unhealthy our identity was, kind of on that thin layer of the mainstream. And again, these kind of led to the rationale of, or the premise of the archive was gosh, I know as a designer that there's a bunch of great stuff going on. Why is the general public not connected to this stuff? And I really started, again, this is almost 20 years ago, but I was pretty floored by this design, which was created by Chris Charles. It's called the Lucky Iron Fish. Really simple design. It was spread out throughout developing countries, given away by Canada aid. It's an iron fish that you put in your pot. It promises luck as a fish does, but cures anemia. I can't know how you pronounce that, but essentially a iron deficiency. But I was floored that this design that had such a huge impact was completely unknown in Canada and had not been celebrated at all. And I began to explore, like, what other stories are waiting to be told? What else is out there that hasn't had attention? And this was kind of the departure of the Canadian Archive. Now, we know that design historians, writers, curators want to talk about first. We know that Eames did something first. We know Drogue Design did something first. I wanted to show some of the lessons that I learned while doing the archive that we're putting Canada up first, kind of on these design chops. It was interesting to find the very first steam bent chair was from Canada. The first fiberglass molded chair was from Canada. But here's a few other ones for us to think about. At one time, Canada produced the fastest sports car in the world, the ATT Plethore by Sebastian Forrest. I love this photo, of course, because there's a giant snowbank in the back. We're used to seeing these things, you know, ripping around Modena or on some Roman parking lot. This is, to me, a little bit of a snapshot of what happens in Canada. These guys, you know, up north are producing this car, which for about a year was the fastest supercar in the world. But the company flopped because, of course, nobody in the world wanted a supercar from Canada. It had to be from Modena. It had to be from Germany. If it was from any other place, it had no locational advantage. So I really started to uncover, like, the locational advantage behind products really doesn't matter. That it matters that fashion brands come from Paris or Italy. You know, the story of where it's from really is important. Here again, we have a great product, a beautiful story, but it didn't have that locational advantage behind it. So the company eventually went bankrupt. The next one of that we found that was really interesting was, if you imagine the influence of skateboard culture globally, we all imagine it came out of Southern California. About a year or two before it came out of California, the first skateboards were being produced in Vancouver, Canada. And a company emerged, which was the first skateboard brand, which is called Skull Skates. Again, nobody knows the story, just isn't told. And of course, because those stories don't get told, there's no industry that ever develops behind it. So Canada doesn't have Vans, doesn't have like Paulo Peralta or Tony Hawk. We never had that. Just no one ever kind of bothered to tell it. The next one I thought was interesting was the first mountain bikes. Of course, mountain bikes were a huge industry out of California. It revolutionized and essentially saved the bike industry. But we found evidence early on that the first bikes being produced were coming not out of the valleys of California, but were coming from the North Shore in Vancouver, BC. Again, just another sort of product story that Canadians didn't celebrate. There's no star-making machine here. So there was just this humbleness. People were making them and riding them and doing it, but they had no appetite or spirit to go bigger. Again, the Americans took these stories and ran with them, and now we think of it all as coming from there, but it actually has a bit of a deeper story. Obviously, anything to do with winter, Canadians, you know, have just by our geography a claim to it. We spent a lot of time looking at what First Nations were doing, first parka, first snow goggles, and we're pretty floored by what was there. You know, Canada has done a good job at kind of holding some of these brands. Again, we think of Canada Goose. There's got to be probably a 15 to 20 ultra high-end winter coat brands being coming out of Canada, but it all starts back here. The interesting thing is that few of them, Canada Goose is the exception, actually make a nod to this past. They talk about themselves more in relationships to high tech, the qualities, the materials, the types of materials, the manufacturing, how they're made, but they don't actually draw DNA to where it truly came from. So they don't see the DNA of time, the storytelling aspect, but it is there. The last one, which I always get a giggle about, and most people are a bit shocked, was that Crocs are from Canada. The person who designed them from Quebec saw them really as a boat shoe and nothing more. And when they took the product down to Florida, a kind of savvy business person, bought the molds, basically bought the entire project from them. And of course, within a few years, the Croc shoe was born. Had a bit of a rocky history, but as we know, it has fallen into favor in fashion circles. But of course, it has this really unknown background that it actually started in Canada and was living here as a gardening shoe and as a boat shoe for 5-10 years before it exploded globally. Canadians didn't see that as a thing, and it just disappeared from our life. Now, the archive has identified many areas. These were just some firsts I think we're curious to talk about. I wanted to talk about some of the areas that we discovered over the past 20 years that Canadians themselves don't realize that we're actually expert in. So again, beyond beavers, beyond maple syrup, beyond Tim Hortons cups, there was these quiet industries that were working and producing like global products, again, that never seemed to make the news. There was no documentary made about them. They never kind of got headlines here. So therefore, Canadians themselves, they're very surprised when you reflect it back to them. Like, your neighbor is making, something like this. This is the archive was one of our little happy points, which opened up an entire community to us, was when we kind of by accident, we were calling First Nations work design. And we were hearing from band leadership that this was the first time their work hadn't been called archaeology. And this was really compelling that we were talking about, like, this was when I was talking about my design students, like, imagine having a client where you say, we're going to create a warm shelter in one of the most hostile places in the world, 0 carbon footprint. Everything you make it from will be found. And when you leave it, it will disappear back into the earth. That sounds like spaceship shit. That is like, you couldn't even go to DARPA and get them to put $1 billion. No one would be able to do it. But here we are, this is coming up. And again, no one had called this architecture. No one had called it design until the archive. And we found that this got us, a lot of credit into First Nations that we were very happy to receive. And those partnerships have been really, really rewarding for us. The other area that's kind of compelling is in cycling. You don't think of Canada as being a cycling nation. You think of places like Holland and Italy. Meanwhile, Canadians are producing the fastest bicycle in the world. Our record holder, triathlon bikes, Cervelo Cycles in Toronto has won the Tour de France 10 times. Again, this is a story that is not headlines in Canada. You do not read this. These are not household brands. These are not names that most Canadians would recognize. So again, this is kind of where the archive lives. The other area that I thought was super interesting was looking at high-end audio. The best turntables, speakers, audio cables are coming from Canada. You just wouldn't expect that. Most people don't. This is Oracle produced out of Montreal. Beautiful work. Again, just an area that Canadians kind of, without really having any support, there wasn't a government business grant, there wasn't sort of a culture grant. They just kind of quietly began to dominate these areas by producing beautiful products. This was an interesting one for the archive. Canada is leading in EV production, basically the knowledge behind electric vehicles. The archive was producing some work, gosh, it's got to be 10 years ago now, that we realized, how can Canada not producing its own vehicle? We have the largest parts manufacturer in the world, which is Magna. We have some of the most forward-leaning factories in the world that produce cars, mostly American and Japanese. And we had the raw goods. We were making the battery components that go into EV vehicles, but no one had thought that we should make one here. It kind of reminds me of, well, I'll get into it next, but here we had all the raw ingredients to produce a really serious industry, but somebody just wasn't connecting the dots, kind of. We were living in our Tim Hortons fog, and we just kind of didn't realize that this was happening in our backyard. Now, thankfully, this is starting to bear fruit. The federal government put a very aggressive program together last year. And this is the first vehicle that's about to hit the road in a few months, that the country's producing the EV vehicles, which is great, and the batteries and the raw goods for all the solar panels and batteries that go in the cars. This one was kind of interesting to me. Again, you don't realize it. The top luthiers and musical instruments are coming from Canada. I would have assumed they would have come from really almost anywhere else. but our research was exposing that the best guitars were coming from Canada. Now, this had kind of a neater story, which I was less interested in the guitars and the drums and amp brands. I was really interested in like that Canada has a reputation of cutting down the tree and then selling the lumber. You know, we have no, every Canadian would say maple syrup's their kind of product, but we don't have any maple syrup brand. We have no Heinz ketchup of maple syrup. We sell it as a commodity. So we sell like, huge amounts of maple syrup in a massive truck that goes across the border. We buy the Dean and DeLuca brand maple syrup, consume it. Our wood, which was considered the last standing premium wood in the world, was going to places like Italy where they would make a violin and then we would buy it back. So then, in the last decade, this began to change, that we saw our national commodities become slowly converted into product, which I think is an exciting shift for the country, that we see, again, high-end luthier happening, which is quite curious. So by documenting the things that you make, of course, you create new stories. I think that this stereotype that the Canadians are living in, that the archive is working to break that stereotype. We hope that entrepreneurs can understand how to go global with a great story. Creative communities can relish in the areas that they're doing great work, and that Canadians can connect to a broader and more contemporary story of their own. I found that when I got looking at Canadian culture, kind of what wasn't being talked about, it was kind of like going to Disneyland and finding the Smithsonian, that there was this like veneer of hockey sticks and antlers, but all of a sudden you step through that and all these worlds start to open up and you discover all the stuff that's happening there. I don't think the archive has been a star-making machinery, but we definitely have added to the pile of stories, which is creating growth. We can identify where it's creating sort of growth and interest. Now, I think it's interesting when I look back to the places where I cut my design teeth, and I kind of feel sorry for them, and I wonder what their future holds. Our archive now has gone through a 2-year, we've stepped offline. We've spent 2 years now completely revamping it. We've talked to hundreds of designers and people in the creative community to ask them what they would like from the archive, how it can serve them better. We've met with people from tourism and brand side of Canada to talk about how they can relate to these stories and bring them up and begin to use them for kind of identifying ourselves globally. We met with curators and archivists to really understand where the state of the art was in them. We went with tech people to learn where all the kind of crypto and NFT was heading and what that might be for our collection, as well as met with all the marginalized groups and to figure out how we could be more of an ally to them and a better partner for them. And after that, we're just about to relaunch. In about a month, we'll be back online and back in business after this 2-year soul searching. And it's been exciting because we realize now the collection is going to be 100% membership, like owned. I'm giving it all back to the community. It's a functioning like a DOA, so it's more like a co-op now, and that all our tech research will be open source, open code. So if anybody from anywhere else, it's our hope that someone in Cuba will like take our entire back end and create a Cuban design resource, or Brazil will grab it and create, they have all the pieces there to do it, that we will just give it to them. It's entirely open source now. So instead of it being kind of a guarded collection like archives have been in the past, ours has gone the exact opposite way. Now we're struggling. It's been really inspiring to hear other people talk from Wave as well as Zeta about alternative economies, because we're trying to discover ours now, because the business minded are telling us we're making the wrong decision, but our hearts are telling us that we're doing the right thing. But I put these two images up there. I look at Teo's 25,000 euro chest of drawers, and of course Sass's $20,000 shelving. And I wonder what lessons I really did learn from my time away. And I wonder where the design futures are coming. I'm optimistic that Canada has one. It has something to give the global community. And if we can help the other 99% places that aren't Italy, Holland, France, Germany, America, if we can help them get their stories up and out too, I think that's where the future lies when we look at where design's moving, where design can add value, where change is happening, that it probably won't come out of places that we have traditionally heard design stories come from. So yeah, if we can, design can truly change things for the better. It's this knowledge creation that will not come from the oldies, but in these places that we will see being given more space. I think we saw that recently with the Cooper Hewitt did that, the show Other 99%. We were seeing design from Africa, which was mind-blowing. We were seeing stuff that just was, in my mind, way more impressive than this kind of decorative design, this high status design. So here we are, NOR. So we're now not the Canadian Design Archive anymore. We've changed our name to NOR. We took Canadian out of it because that alienated us from a bunch of our communities. I want to just give a shout out to the rest of the team, Joel, Patrick, and the original founder with me, Michael Erdman. So by archiving makers, you could truly discover the reality of a place and create huge value for the creative community and for the national self-image. And more is coming from places where the design history is yet to be written. That's the story of the archive.